You know what I've learned recently? A game doesn't need to be good to be good. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, ooh, did you hear that? This poor fool just said that a game doesn't need to be good to be good. Ooh, does he not realize that he's contradicting himself? Ooh! Yes, I know how it sounds. It doesn't make sense. But let me explain. When it comes to games, or any sort of media really, I think there is a genuine difference between quality and enjoyability. I'm not saying they're mutually exclusive, you can have both or neither at the same time, and they usually go hand in hand, but there are some cases where you have one but not the other. A game could be perfectly functional and well made, but still lack any sort of authentic enjoyment. Alternatively, and admittedly more commonly, a game could be extremely fun, but also be objectively rough and lacking in quality. In that sense, a game doesn't need to be good to be good. Do you know what I mean? I think Crash Twinsanity is the perfect example of this. Crash Twinsanity is one of those games where you can simply look at it and be able to tell that it's half-baked. And yet, raging nostalgia boner aside, it's such a fun game to play. This philosophy has been scratching around in my mind, and I've been trying to make sense of it. What is the relationship between quality and enjoyability? How do they relate to the player's experience? What do I even mean by quality and enjoyability? What do those words mean? What the fuck am I even talking about? Hopefully, by reviewing Crash Twinsanity, I'll be able to sort this mess out. The game starts off by establishing that this is not going to be anything like the Crash games that came before it. Well, that's not entirely true. It's still got Bandicoot deoxyribonucleic acid. At the end of the day, it's still 3D platforming, but Twinsanity goes about it in a different way. You start on Enjoyability Island, not in the corridor-like levels you'd be used to at this point, but instead in an open area. Before cracking on with the game proper, you're given the opportunity to explore around a bit. First-time players would probably be confused by this. It's not something that the Crash series has done before, but I kinda like it. I hate beaches normally, the disgusting salty water that tastes of piss, the seaweed that wraps itself around your feet, and worst of all, the sand, finding its way into every item of clothing and into every single one of your crevices in your mouth, in your ears, up your nose, up your anus, so that you can take it home and find it in unexpected places for years and years to come. What a cunt! Exploring Enjoyability Island, on the other hand, is neat. It introduces you to some of the concepts this game throws at you. More open areas, puzzles, interactable environments, that sort of thing. There are even little details that make the environments feel alive, like the monkeys throwing Wumpa fruit at you. It may seem violent and threatening, but remember, monkeys are famous for throwing their own shit. So unless you're into that, I'd say we all lucked out here. Doing all this rewards you with color gems, which are this game's only optional collectible. Each level/area has 6. Some are obvious and easy to find, others a bit more challenging, but what they all have in common is giving purpose to the extra space. They give you a reason to look around and go off the beaten path, which is something that at this point in the series was new. It's not something the series needed, but it's a little something extra, and if it's not something you're interested in, you can simply ignore it. Just like Jehovah's Witnesses. Ignoring it leads you to the tender, juicy meat of the game. The first proper level is Jungle Bungle, and it has got to be one of the most memorable tutorials I've ever seen. There's nothing particularly special about the gameplay or level design, it's as basic as Crash gets. It teaches you how to jump, spin, slide and slam. There's nothing remarkable about that. What is remarkable is the way the game presents it all to you. Cortex in drag is already amazing on its own, but having him walk you through the tutorial comes with a lot of flavour and humour. It tickles you up until the climax with the first boss battle of the game against Cortex and Mecha Bandicoot, which, let's be honest, is a pretty cool way to start off a game. And that's what's interesting about it. The gameplay wasn't anything special, but despite that it was fun to play. Its personality is what made such a simple tutorial so enjoyable. I find that that's a running theme throughout all of Crash Twinsanity. The gameplay in and of itself is pretty alright most of the time, but the game's personality gives it that little something extra that takes the enjoyment to the next level. But let's put that aside for now. What actually is Crash Twinsanity? Crash Twinsanity is a 3D platformer that takes the traditional formula of the series and puts a little spin on it. Like I've already mentioned, Twinsanity introduces open areas and adds an element of exploration. These areas are filled with puzzles and little physics challenges that reward you with gems. It's a cool addition, and while it does sort of divert the focus of the game away from its 3D platforming core, I didn't mind it. It's actually a clever way of breaking up each individual level without killing momentum entirely. The standard gameplay though is very similar to this game's predecessors. It's more open, but it's very much the same linear level structure we're used to with these games, trying to get from point A to point B without dying. The only big difference besides the openness is the irrelevance of crates. They literally don't do anything in this game besides occasionally acting as an obstacle or a platform. It's just so sad when you see something you love fall from grace. The crates used to be so important, and now look at them. Like a washed up celebrity trying desperately to stay relevant. It's upsetting. But going for all the crates in this game would be a nightmare, so it's for the best. The standard gameplay is slightly more generic because of that, but it's still pretty good. Crash controls well aside from his now useless slide jump where he basically just trips forward, and the levels themselves are reasonably well designed. But that's only a fraction of this game. Crash Twinsanity is full of gimmicks, and this is mainly due to the story, which I actually really like. Our main antagonists are the evil twins, who are two mutated hyper-intelligent parrots who were experimented on by Cortex when he was a child. The experiment resulted in them being transported to the 10th dimension, where they became evil masterminds. They come to exact revenge, and steal all the great things from this dimension and replace it with the horrors of the 10th dimension. Crash and Cortex, unable to beat them alone, team up to stop the evil twins from ruining their home. Although to be honest, I don't think Crash has any idea what's going on at any point. As far as Crash stories go, this is pretty good. It's out there, but I like it. It's not the same generic Cortex tries to take over the world thing we've seen again and again. It's something different. It definitely feels like the developers were high and or drunk when they wrote this story, but that's actually a good thing. Drugs and alcohol unleash creativity. Or domestic violence, it's a 50-50. Crash and Cortex joining forces in the story forms the basis of a lot of Twinsanity's ideas, good or otherwise, and it's reflected heavily in these gimmick gameplay styles. The first two you're exposed to in Cavern Catastrophe, which takes place immediately after the Cortex boss. The first is what is essentially the Atmosphere from Wrath of Cortex, only instead of Crash rolling around in a ball, it's Crash and Cortex beating the ever-loving shit out of each other. I did say there could be domestic violence. When compared to the Atmosphere, it is a bit more unruly and hard to control, but it's still quite fun, and the vehicle itself is definitely more memorable than a hamster ball. I never really understood it. How does he get into that thing? Is there a hatch? Is it like a Zorb ball? Is it witchcraft? I don't really get it. After that sequence, you play as Crash pulling Cortex along by his long, hard crystal. Hey, don't give me that look. We've all thought about it. But not as much as Crunch's cake, I'm sure. I don't really know what to call this style of gameplay, but basically, Crash's mobility and platforming are exchanged for dragging along Cortex, who can be thrown and flung around to activate faraway switches and collect gems to allow both characters to progress. You're essentially playing as Crash and Cortex at the same time, which is cool, in theory. The game doesn't really do anything interesting with this concept. If anything, being hitched to Cortex is a hindrance and just makes the gameplay slightly worse and more annoying. I just think it's missing something. It needs an extra layer, a bit more depth, just something to make it worth having. There is a bit more to it in Boiler Room Doom, where the greatest evil scientist in the world gets stuck in a pipe. But I don't think that's enough to sell this gameplay style to me. I'd rather just play as Crash and leave Cortex to fiddle with his long hard crystal. I feel like I have to mention though, Cortex can teleport. Time and time again across the game, he does a little spin and zips across the screen. This explains how he ends up in places he wouldn't be able to reach otherwise. But I have to ask, why doesn't he do that all the time? Why do we have to drag him along with us when it would be so much easier for him to teleport away so Crash can focus on his platforming? What are you up to, Cortex? What are your motives? Are you trying to be a nuisance? Or are you trying to make up for lost time and bond with your mutant bandicoot son? If so, that's very sweet, but maybe you could do that after the threat of interdimensional calamity has been dealt with? Then you've got the two gimmicks that immediately spring to mind when I think about this game. The first is Flight of the Bumblebee, where Cortex is running for his fucking life, and Crash needs to clear the obstacles from his path so that he survives. Even though at the end of the day this is just more standard platforming, it presents a different kind of challenge, and it's honestly pretty cool. The other is where Crash, after intensely staring at Cortex's ass and giving the whole father-son dynamic a worrying sexual undertone, decides to use him as a snowboard. While the concept of this gameplay style is amusing and entertaining, it can be a bit of a nightmare to play. It can be pretty tough to maneuver Crash and Cortex because of how out of control they are. No amount of speeding up or slowing down will make controlling them any easier. It can make going for all of the gems a real pain in the ass. And finally, you have 2 extra playable characters who appear in only 1 level each, save for the final boss where they return. The first is Cortex. Playing as Cortex is, in my humble opinion, fucking horrible. It sounds like it would be fun in theory, running around, shooting his little plasma gun, defeating hordes of enemies and escaping from a violent roach infestation. But the reality of it is bad. It's just not very interesting. I like the opportunity to play as Cortex, but actually doing it, I'd rather not. Just running around and spamming the shoot button gets old pretty quickly. His other moves, I mean, he may as well not even have them. He can jump, but it's ridiculously short. His feet lift higher off the ground when he walks. He has a slide where he just eats shit, and some weird mid-air plasma ground blast that I didn't even know existed until just now. He can also strafe. All of these moves are useless. The only button you need is the shoot button. But this is yet another Cortex inconsistency. First the teleportation, and now this. Cortex's moveset reflects his brains over brawn nature, highlighting his intellect and demonstrating his physical weakness. But the thing is, we already know that he's actually just as physically capable as Crash. Look at the tutorial. He does all the same spins and jumps and slams that Crash does. Why is he suddenly so pathetic when we take control of him? The only difference between here and the beginning of the game is that he isn't cosplaying as Coco anymore. Oh my god. That's it, isn't it? Cortex feels empowered when he's dressed in drag. He believes in himself when he puts on the wig, and he's able to pull off these feats. Honestly, that's so inspiring! Anyway, then you have Nina, who is Cortex's daughter and or niece. We're not sure. But hey, things get confusing when you impregnate your sister. Cortex should have thought ahead. Nina is actually pretty fun to play as. She's essentially Crash, with the added ability to use her bionic hands to grapple onto things and swing around. I can't really complain. But it would have been more fun if I wasn't playing Nina's level in slow motion. My experience playing Twinsanity for this video wasn't exactly smooth. There were a noticeable amount of performance issues, a lot of slowdown, out-of-sync audio, that sort of thing. It seemed to be level specific, so I wasn't sure what was causing it. It was never a problem in my innocent childhood. I was pretty dense back then and not much has changed, but I think I would have noticed that. So what the shit was going on? Well, a bit of research revealed that pretty much all the issues I was having was down to the Xbox 360's backwards compatibility. It wasn't the game being shit, it was the console being shit. Which was a relief in a way, but I would have preferred to just play normally. Honestly, the more I use it, the more I start to think the Xbox 360's backwards compatibility is complete dog shit. It's always fucking around with these games in one way or another. There were other bugs and odd things happening, but the only one I remember that wasn't the fault of the console was Crash occasionally not having his run animation and gliding along the floor like a ghost ready to suck the soul out of his victims. Probably the most normal part of this game. Thankfully, the performance issues sorted themselves out by the time I got to Madame Amberley, who was the big boss for that area. Although, big might be underselling her a little. The boss fights in this game are actually pretty good, which is unusual for the Crash series. They're known for being pushovers, and while they still are pathetic in Twinsanity, they are generally more enjoyable. The opening boss was amazing, and the others were fun and all had some amount of spectacle. Big robot, big arms, big frog, big flames, big tits. They were all pretty good. The weakest one was probably Uka Uka, who fell, literally, within seconds. It was very underwhelming. I can't believe that's the extent of his evil power. Remember when he threatened to inflict 1,000 years of suffering upon the entire universe? Hard to imagine after that fight. What's he gonna do? Yell? Melt? It's embarrassing. At least the music was good. The music in Twinsanity is actually something very unique. The soundtrack was made by Spiral Mouth, and every single song in the game is a cappella, and it's wicked. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but even if you don't like it, you have to admit that it's something different and that it helps this game stand out. Not that it needed that, it's pretty weird in almost every way, but it's still pretty cool. And I'd say the game looks pretty decent as well. It's nothing overly special, but it certainly looks a lot better than the game that came before it. The environments are vibrant and have a lot of flavour if you know what I mean. When you put all the pieces of this puzzle together, you realize that Crash Twinsanity is the most mixed bag of all time. It's such a weird game. When you think about it, it should be bad. It has all the hallmarks of a bad game. It's very short, it has a lot of gimmicks and some extra playable characters, it experimented with new ideas but didn't really do a whole lot with them, and on top of that, I'm pretty sure it had a rough development cycle. You can tell from all the concept art you unlock by collecting gems, cut levels and locations like Balloon City, cut characters like Evil Coco, Entrance and this space monk lady, even cut concepts like Crash wielding a sword. This game was clearly meant to be so much more than what it was. When you think about all of that, Crash Twinsanity should have been a spectacular failure. And yet, it's great. Yes, it's rough around the edges, yes, it made some questionable choices, yes, there is a lot of room for improvement. Yet, despite all that, it's a fun game. Even with its issues, there was never a point where I wasn't enjoying myself at all. It's consistently fun. The gameplay is simple but enjoyable. Some of the gimmicks are fun, and when they're not fun, they're at least funny. The game is presented very well with a unique story, personality and soundtrack, and it's got a great sense of humour which elevates it all a bit further. And in all honesty, it's very hard to ignore the nostalgia factor. Normally I can set it aside, but with this game I struggled to ignore my childhood memories with it. Its nostalgia factor was too powerful. Easily more powerful than Uka Uka. Even if the game, on a technical level, leaves a lot to be desired, it's still a fun game that's worth playing. And that brings me back to my initial point. A game doesn't need to be good to be good. Crash Twinsanity is a great example of quality versus enjoyability. If you focus on the technical side of things, Crash Twinsanity is not great. In terms of quality, it's lacking. But that doesn't mean it's lacking in enjoyability. Things like presentation and personality make what would have been a mediocre game into something great. The game's enjoyability acts as a sort of counterbalance, which means that even though it isn't good, it's still good. I feel like I've lost my mind talking in circles about this game. Crash Twinsanity is a mess, but in the best possible way. The game has a soul that makes it so easy to look past its flaws, and I think that's the case for a lot of games. Obviously, what's good is a matter of personal opinion, and some games are bad no matter which way you look at it, but I think this philosophy works. A game doesn't need to be good to be good. To sum it up, Crash Twinsanity is a lot like my pubes, messy and full of bugs, but still played with and loved by children everywhere. And that's what really matters.